Well, Todman, could we look behind the cautious optimism about a deal to what is motivating the various parties? Why is it in Benjamin Netanyahu's interest to do a deal here? We know that two of his ministers are threatening to resign if he signs up.
Yes, I think the main the main motive for Netanyahu is getting the hostages released. This has not seemed to be as much of a priority for him as it has been for President Biden and some of the other actors involved. But pressure has really been growing in Israel, and I think he has determined that it is time now to get this deal done. And in some ways, part of the motivation is the pressure that President-elect Trump is placing on him. I think that actually gives him a bit of cover with those members of his government that you mentioned. These are two far-right ministers who have continually threatened to resign throughout the negotiations and what they have described as a capitulation and a deal that will undermine Israel's security.
So what about Hamas? How has its strategic thinking been changed by the shifting power balance in the region? You know, what's happened in Syria, Lebanon and Iran?
Yes, I think it has. So on one hand, Hamas has now faced a really devastating military offensive from Israel for nearly, a year and a half now, really, at this stage. Certainly, their capabilities have been severely downgraded. A huge number of their leaders have been assassinated. And for them, I think this is partly about survival. But as you mentioned, it's also a reflection of the changing balance of power in the region. So since we last had a serious talk about coming to a ceasefire, a number of events in the region have undermined key allies and partners of Hamas. So firstly, Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah had opened a front to the north of Israel in support of Palestinians in Gaza, but then Israel's offensive that ramped up in the autumn of last year devastated Hezbollah, again taking out a huge number of their leadership, really downgrading their capabilities. And then, as you mentioned as well, the ouster of Bashar al-Assad in Syria has also been a real loss to Hamas. Not because Bashar al-Assad was really a supporter of Hamas. Actually, he did very little to counter Israel since October the 7th, but because his key backer was Iran, and Iran has now lost a lot of its influence in Syria. I think those factors together put Hamas at a much weaker position and made them more likely to capitulate on some of the concessions that they had previously refused to give.
Well, you've mentioned the presence of President Trump in all of this. We've got this unusual situation where both the outgoing and incoming presidents have skin in the game. What's motivating them to get an outcome, possibly even before the inauguration next week?
It's such an interesting convergence of their interests. We have on one hand President Biden, who I think is determined to have made progress on Gaza before he leaves office. He doesn't want his legacy to have been a failure to reach a ceasefire and a failure to end this violence that has streamed across news channels and screens across the world. And for President Trump, I think he gets to say that it was his influence that ultimately succeeded in getting us across the finish line for this deal. This ultimately was a deal that President Biden first floated back in May, and yet there has been no progress on it for those months. So I think it is credible for him to say that it is his influence that caused this war to end. But I think more importantly for President-elect Trump, he wants the war to end before he takes office. He wants to enter office and begin his second term at a time of calm in the Middle East to lay the foundations for the policy that he hopes to pursue in the region, which is to continue the legacy that he had in his first term of advancing normalization agreements between Arab states and Israel.
So just to summarise, what are we expecting that this deal will actually do?
So this is an agreement that would be implemented over phases. The first phase would see the gradual release of Israeli hostages that are being held by Hamas in Gaza. The number that is being cited is 33. So that number, it includes women, it includes children, those who are over the age of 50, and those who are severely injured. At the same time, then in coordination, Israel would release hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, some of whom have been held in prison in Israel for a long time. We then move into the second phase of this deal. It would see Israel begin to withdraw from the Gaza Strip to allow more movement, to allow Palestinians in Gaza to return to their homes in the north of the Strip, to withdraw from this strategic Netzrim corridor in the center of the Gaza Strip. And ultimately, then Israel would withdraw to some kind of border area around Gaza. What I haven't seen discussion of is what comes next in Gaza. There is some talk about the Palestinian Authority, which is currently based in the West Bank, being brought back into Gaza to try to unite the two Palestinian territories and to try to set up a government there. They will face real challenges with that. They have a huge lack of legitimacy. And so I think there are a lot of very difficult questions that will lie ahead. So it's too soon to say whether this could be the start of a really sustainable peace deal. But I think these steps are necessary to get to the stage where we can start having those conversations more seriously.
Will Todman, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thanks so much for having me.